Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold went to Columbine High School on April 20th, 1999, determined to destroy everything in their path. But 5 years later, some survivors say they actually helped create something, a faith in God that has helped them cope and move beyond the tragedy at Columbine.
Isaiah was one of the few black students there. They targeted him out for his color. I remember him slowly backing up, and the last thing that he said was that he wanted to see his mom. They shot Isaiah, and then they just turned their gun right towards Matt, and he was killed.
The most tragic scene at Columbine would be in the library, where Craig Scott and his two friends Matt and Isaiah were studying. Harris and Klebold would kill 10 students and wound several others there. Craig Scott would also lose his sister Rachel that day. She was killed after telling Klebold and Harris that she believed in God. Michael Johnson, now 20, was among the first shooting victims at Columbine. He was sitting with friends in the schoolyard when he was shot in the leg, arm, and jaw.
It was very surreal. None of us really believed what it really was until a couple of us got shot.
Johnson eventually found shelter behind a shed and escaped the mayhem unfolding around him. For Craig Scott, the loss of his sister Rachel and his two friends has made forgiveness a struggle at times, but he says his faith in God has helped him win that battle.
I really chose a path of forgiveness towards them, and it was more for myself. It wasn't a good thing to dwell on that anger and that hatred that I had struggled with. It was almost like a letting go.
Johnson says he's also moved on since the tragedy at Columbine. He's written a book about the experience called Surviving Columbine, How Faith Helps Us Find Peace When Tragedy Strikes.
I'm thankful for my trials. I know that if we turn to God in everything we do, we will be happy.
Pat, God provides restoration, doesn't he?
It's amazing the forgiveness that's in the heart of those students. Instead of being bitter and resentful and filled with hatred, they're filled with love and compassion. It is an extraordinary demonstration of Christian love that's coming out of those students, and they can be an example for every one of us.
Five years ago today, two boys carried out what would become the nation's deadliest school shooting. Questions still remain as to why the Columbine massacre happened. One of the Columbine killers, though, was taking antidepressant medication, and some experts believe those drugs may have played a role. Senior medical reporter Galen Tethrow has more.
April 20th, 1999, a day Mark Taylor will never forget.
I think of it every single day.
And he's got the scars to prove it.
What all these are from?
This is a cut when they were opening me to see if they can find the bullets inside of me, to see if it had hit any major arteries in my body.
That was the day Taylor was hit by more than a dozen rounds fired by gunman Eric Harris at Columbine High School. Taylor just barely survived the rampage in which Harris and fellow student Dylan Klebold carried out the nation's deadliest school shooting, killing 12 students and a teacher before shooting themselves. 5 years later, questions remain as to why they did it. Mark Taylor's convinced it has to do with medications like this, antidepressants called SSRIs. That's short for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Eric Harris was on an SSRI. Autopsy reports show he had the antidepressant Luvox in his system at the time of the Columbine shooting. Harris had been taking the drug since early 1998, and just 3 months before the Columbine killings, his dose was doubled. Taylor thinks Luvox triggered Harris's attack on Columbine and is now on a crusade to ban the drug and others like it. SSRI antidepressants hit the headlines in March when the Food and Drug Administration issued a health advisory on 10 popular types. With more than 150 million prescriptions written in the U.S. alone yearly, the names are quite familiar: Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, and the list goes on. The FDA is now concerned about clinical trials where some patients taking the drugs demonstrated increased hostility and more suicidal thoughts.
I think these drugs are far too deadly to remain on the market.
Dr. Ann Tracy is the director of the International Coalition for Drug Awareness. She says the way SSRIs work makes them deadly. They regulate a chemical in the brain called serotonin, a neurotransmitter that plays a role in mood and behavior. Infamous crimes have been committed by people on SSRIs, Andrea Yates, convicted of killing her children in Texas, was on Effexor. 19-year-old Corey Badsgard had just increased his dose of SSRI when he walked into his high school carrying a loaded rifle.
I was getting pretty low, like rock bottom. You know, suicide was a constant thought that I was having.
In early February, Food and Drug Administration advisors discussed concerns about the unknown effects of the drugs on children and the fear that some antidepressants may increase suicidal tendencies. Advisors told the FDA that the use of antidepressants by children and teenagers is skyrocketing, despite lack of evidence that they alleviate depression, and some evidence that they may even make it worse. FDA officials responded by asking manufacturers to place bolder warning labels on the drugs. Dr. Aradhana Sood is a leading researcher on the effects of SSRIs and other mood-altering medications on children. She's the chair of child and adolescent psychiatry at Virginia Commonwealth University and medical director for the Virginia Treatment Center for Children in Richmond, Virginia.
I feel that we have known for at least a decade that selective SSRIs do cause what is called a hypomanic disinhibition, meaning that in certain children, they will produce a heightened sense of impulsiveness.
But unlike Dr. Tracy, Dr. Sood says the problem is not the medication, but the physicians prescribing them.
It is a wide variety of people who are, and I don't want to be patronizing, but who are not trained adequately in child psychiatry, who are now prescribing antidepressants a great deal and do not realize the risk that carries. They might think that as the child is getting more irritable, that the depression is increasing. And what they do is they increase the medication, which makes it even worse.
The Food and Drug Administration estimates that in 2002, doctors wrote a record number of antidepressant prescriptions for children under 18, about 11 million. Nearly 3 million of those prescriptions were for children 11 and under. Overall, the FDA estimates that sales of antidepressant drugs in the United States increased from 14 million prescriptions in 1992 to 157 million in 2002.
I find more that doctors are actually encouraging and putting lots of pressure on parents to medicate their children.
The government has been reviewing the safety of antidepressants since last summer. The FDA's counterpart in Britain first sounded the alarm last year when it banned all SSRIs except Prozac for patients under 18. Taylor says he hopes the U.S. will eventually do the same, but until then, he'll be working toward that goal.
This is a mission that I can't stop. I want to stop it. I want to get on with my own life, but it's just too important.
And while Dr. Sood believes the drugs work in helping children overcome major depressive disorders, she does take seriously each decision to place a child on antidepressants.
The decision to be put on medications is a very important one. It's what's going to affect their life for a long period of time, because this is not an antibiotic.
Until the questions about SSRIs are settled, FDA officials say parents with kids who are taking the drugs need to watch for symptoms like agitation, anxiety, and hostility, signs that their children may be heading for trouble. Galen Tethrow, CBN News.
The family of Columbine victim Rachel Scott is choosing to remember her death in a positive way. Rachel was shot after refusing to deny her faith in Jesus Christ. Rather than mourning her loss, they're celebrating the way that God is using her life to teach others about himself. Her brother Craig, who survived the terror, has dealt with his grief by focusing on forgiveness.
I really chose a path of forgiveness towards them, and it was more for myself. It wasn't a good thing to dwell on that anger and that hatred.
Rachel's father, Daryl, has shared his daughter's powerful testimony in high schools across the nation, and many have professed their faith in Christ as a result. Rachel's dad says students who've heard her story have canceled their own plans to kill themselves or others. When we come back, why scientists